So today I want to talk about one of the most subtle but profound and powerful principles of human behavior and thought. And that is the idea of taking responsibility, which is exceptionally subtle because when you're looking at it from the outside, you can have two people doing exactly the same task, but the one is doing the task because he's been instructed to and he's not really worried whether it succeeds or fails. The other person's doing the exact same task, but carries the mental load of feeling that this job is theirs and that if it doesn't succeed, they bear the ultimate responsibility for that. And on the outside, they're doing exactly the same thing, but the one carries the mental load and the other doesn't. The one is taking responsibility, the other doesn't. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong about not taking responsibility, it's just that that's not their job. And so responsibility changes everything. And it becomes a burden. By definition, it is a burden because you own the responsibility whether this thing succeeds or fails, whether the job gets done or not. And therefore, there is a natural human instinct to seek to avoid responsibility, not about avoiding the work. Sometimes a person doesn't mind doing the job, but carrying the responsibility is something completely different. And what we see in this week's Parsha, Parshat Shemot, is that at the heart and soul of the greatest Jewish leader of all time, Moses, was the idea of taking responsibility. Because what we read about at the beginning of the Parsha, he grows up in the palace because that's how, as everybody well knows, the events that took place, which are described in our Parsha, that the princess, the daughter of Pharaoh, finds him in the river. She raises him in the palace. He has all the privileges of growing up in the royal household, and he leaves the palace and he goes out, and it says he sees his brothers, he sees their suffering, and as a result, he springs into action. When he sees, as the Parsha describes, an Egyptian attacking a Jew, he goes to their defense and defends his brothers, even though he was not required to. It wasn't his job. And in fact, he had everything to lose and nothing to gain from it. And he does lose everything because of his intervention there, he has to flee. Eventually, he has to flee Egypt. And then later on, he sees two Jews who are fighting, and he seeks to intervene there to bring peace. Again, who appointed him to do this? What was his job? It wasn't his job, but he had a sense of responsibility. There was a need. He felt the responsibility. He takes responsibility. There's great personal cost. And then the third incident of him taking responsibility, we also read in the Parsha, he flees to a place called Midian. He arrives at the well, and the daughters of the local leader, Yitro, are there, and they are getting bullied by other shepherds who are trying to take the water away from them. Again, he takes action. He defends the vulnerable. He takes responsibility. He didn't have to do that, yet he does. And once again, we see him showing and taking responsibility. And yet, in our Parsha as well, God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and he asks him to do the most important job in all of history, which was to be the person to lead the Jewish people on taking them out of the land of Egypt, out of the slavery, leading them to Mount Sinai, taking them into the land of Israel. He offers him the biggest and most important job in all of history, and Moses says, no. Initially, he refuses. He tries to get out of it. He's reluctant. Initially, he says he doesn't outright reject Hashem's request, but he says, "Is there nobody better? Am I the right person?" He said, "I'm not very eloquent. Aral Sfatayim. I'm a person who can't really speak that well." And he gives a list of excuses why perhaps he's not the best person. So here is a really interesting thing: is Moses a person who takes responsibility or not? On the one hand, we see in the first three incidents of the Parsha, he takes responsibility. And yet, when it comes to the ultimate job of responsibility, to be the one who's going to lead the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, he defers, he demurs, he doesn't want to take it. And he says to Hashem, "Can't you find somebody else who could be better for this job? I'm sure there's somebody who's better than me for the job." There, he doesn't want to take responsibility. How do we put these two things together? The answer, I believe, lies in a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot in chapter 2, Mishnah 6. The Mishnah says like this: "Uvemakom she'ein anashim hishtadi liyos ish." In a place where there are no leaders, strive to be a leader. That's what the Mishnah says. Now, what's interesting about this, the way that the Mishnah is phrased, and the Sforno makes this point, the Gemara, he quotes from the Gemara in Brachos, where the Gemara learns from this Mishnah, you only take responsibility to be a leader when there's nobody else to do it. And so in that sense, Moshe was really following exactly that. Where there was nobody else to do it, he takes responsibility. But then when God offers him this position, he says, maybe there's somebody else. Now, why is that? You see, we've got to try and understand this Mishnah. Why is that? If taking responsibility is an expression of leadership, and more than an expression of leadership, it's the most basic expression of morality and of the greatness of the human being is to accept responsibility, why does the Mishnah then create this caveat that says, only if there's nobody else to do it? Surely that's the very opposite of taking responsibility. You know, when you phrase and say, take responsibility if there's nobody else to do it, then your gut reaction is, let somebody else do it. Isn't that the very opposite of responsibility? How can the Mishnah, which teaches responsibility, actually be showing the opposite of responsibility and says, find somebody else to do it? How do we understand that? And I think part of the understanding in this Mishnah is the following. You see, taking responsibility is not all good. It has a number of moral pitfalls, because what is the driving force behind a person who wants to take responsibility? Is the driving force, it could be ego, to feel important, because if you're coming in to save the day, you're going to be the one who's going to take responsibility for others. There's a tremendous sense of an ego boost in that. It could also be for the need for honor and for recognition, for kavod, which we know is one of the most detrimental of all of the character traits, where it says that the pursuit of honor removes a person from this world, as we know in chapter 4, Mishnah 28. Or it also could be about feeling superior to others, which is the ultimate of the character traits, the faulty character traits of gaiva, of arrogance, looking down upon others, exercising power over others. Because when you take responsibility, then you're superior, you're exercising power, you're taking responsibility for others, to help others, you become the center of attraction. And so there are negative dimensions to taking responsibility. There are moral pitfalls. On the other hand, there is positive taking responsibility. And so when it is driven from a positive place, when it's not about me, in other words, you can take responsibility and it's all about me, or you can take responsibility and say it's about the cause. What does the cause need? What our sages call l'shem shamayim. Like it says in chapter 2, Mishnah 2, the Mishnah says that we should be oskim im hatzibur, those who get involved in the community should do it for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim. And so then taking responsibility says, well, what is the job that needs to get done for the sake of the cause, for the sake of heaven? And so if we go back to the case of Moses, because it helps us understand this, when there was nobody else around, when there was he was a prince of the palace and there was no one to defend the Jew who was getting attacked by the Egyptian, he steps in, because who else is going to do it? When he sees two Jews fighting, there's no one else to make peace, so he steps in. When he sees the daughters of Jethro in a situation of vulnerability, he steps in. Then God comes to him and he says, look, I've got the most important job in all of human history and I want you to do it. Moses then says, are you sure I'm the right man for the job? I mean, I'm not eloquent. You want a leader here who can speak. I'm not good with words. When I'm speaking, you're going to need somebody who can be more charismatic than me. Is there nobody else who's better? He pushes Hashem on this. And there it's not because he doesn't want to take responsibility. It's because his drive to take responsibility comes from wanting the cause to succeed, wanting Hashem's will to succeed, and he wants to do it l'shem shamayim. And so then he says, am I actually the best person? And that's why the Mishnah, when it frames responsibilities, says the very first thing that a person should be thinking is, what about somebody else? Not because you're looking to avoid responsibility, but looking to say, am I actually the best person for this? It's like actually, in a certain way, stepping back and being objective and saying, okay, it's true, I've got certain qualities, and this situation calls for those qualities, but maybe there's somebody better than me who could do this. That's very humble. It's also somebody who is aware of the complexity of how things can go wrong. Like the author of our Mishnah is Hillel, who was one of the great Jewish leaders of our Talmudic sages. And in the previous Mishnah, he says, gives other leadership principles, the way that in the Mishnah in chapter 2, Mishnah 5, the Tiferet Yisrael says that he's also giving other leadership principles there. Like it says there, Al tamin ba'atzmacha ad yom motcha. Do not believe in yourself until the day of your death. Don't be overconfident. There's no room for complacency. And so he cautions, Al tadin chavercha ad shetegil lemkomo. Do not judge a person until you've been in his place. Do not say that something could never happen, because anything could happen. And so you learn from Hillel's approach to leadership. It requires humility. It requires self-awareness. And so too in the taking of responsibility, it requires humility, self-awareness to say, am I really the best person for it? And so that measured approach ensures that what one is doing is l'shem shemaim. It is sincerely for the sake of the cause and not for the ulterior motives and the benefits that accrue to a person from being the center, from being the one who is helping others. But here comes something really interesting in this Mishnah, because the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah learn this Mishnah, which is all about taking responsibility, in a way that is quite unexpected at first glance, and even one could say revolutionary, because the Mishnah says, in a place where there are no leaders, you should strive to be a leader. And so therefore, the way that Rabbi Ovadia Bar Tanura and Rabbeinu Yonah, one of his interpretations, understands this is talking in a social context. And there's a social need, and now the question is, who steps into the gap? The Rambam says, this Mishnah is actually talking about yourself. It's saying like this, if there's no one to teach you, teach yourself. Rabbeinu Yonah says, if there's no one to direct you, to criticize you, to push you to achieve more and to get closer to Hashem and to do better in our mitzvahs, then do that for yourself. Meaning, what they actually learn, how they approach this Mishnah, is that it's not about taking responsibility for others in a leadership social context. It is about taking responsibility for yourself. Now, that's really interesting, because they flipped the whole Mishnah. You hear what they're doing here. When you look at the Mishnah, it says, in a place where there are no leaders, you must be a leader. And then they say, you know what that means is, where there's a place where there's no one else who can lead? That's you. That's you. In other words, what they're really saying is, what is the ultimate place where there's nobody else who can do the job? Remember, we said the principle about taking responsibility is to make sure there's nobody else who can do it. So you know what the Rambam says? Where there is nobody else who can do and take responsibility, that's for you. You have to take responsibility for you. That is where taking responsibility starts. And you would think you don't have to say that, because obviously taking responsibility has got to start with yourself. But actually, it's in a certain way, it's more comfortable and it's easier to take responsibility for other people than it is to take responsibility for yourself. Because when you're busy worrying about other people, then you say, okay, I'm worrying about them, then you're feeling superior, I'm looking after them. And it doesn't actually require you to do anything, because you're trying to get other people to get involved, and you're trying to get other people to do what they need to do. And there is a comfort in the distance of, I'll look after you, but what about myself? That's why it's fascinating. I may have mentioned this book before, but it continues to fascinate me. Paul Johnson, one of the great historians of modern times, wrote a book called Intellectuals, where he discusses the great intellectuals of the modern Western world. And he says this, he points out the discrepancy between the beauty of their writings and their preachings and their teachings versus the ugliness of their personal life. That they were preaching the most elevated ethical concepts, and yet in their personal lives, many of them, and he goes through the whole book, is basically digging up the dirt on the great intellectuals of modern Western civilization. And he goes through Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Karl Marx, Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, all of them. And he shows the discrepancy between their private lives and their public lives. Because you see, it's much easier to take responsibility for another person than it is to fix your own life. And so he goes through the litany of where they went wrong, of the betrayed marriages, of the children that they abandoned, of all of the worst moral crimes that you can imagine, while preaching the loftiest things to the world, because sometimes it's so much easier to take responsibility for other people. That's why the Mishnah says, start by taking responsibility for yourself, because nobody else can do that for you. And that has to be your primary responsibility, which then links to the other Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the very famous one, chapter 1, Mishnah 14. Ein ani li, mi li. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Which there the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah say, if I don't do my mitzvahs, who's going to do those mitzvahs for me? And if I don't inspire myself, who will inspire me? And if I don't correct myself, who's going to correct me? If I don't take responsibility for myself, for my life, then who will do that for me? And that applies not only, it applies in the learning of Torah, it applies in doing mitzvahs, it applies in our faith, it also applies in parnosa, in relationships, in every dimension of human existence. It says we got to start by taking responsibility for self. But it doesn't end there, because in the next part of the Mishnah says, Ukshani la'atzmi mani. If I'm only for myself, what am I? Which the Sforno says, what does that mean? If I'm only for myself, meaning if I don't help other people and teach them and reach out to them and help them with their lives. So you actually need to have both. It starts internally and then expands beyond that. And what emerges from all of this, as we come to the end, because what we've seen and what we've learned from Moses is the idea of taking responsibility. But we've seen that means a certain reluctance, because it starts by taking responsibility for self and an awareness and a humility that it's not about us, it's about a greater cause, but it starts by taking personal responsibility for ourselves and then going on to help others. Now, the final point in all of this, what emerges from this is a fascinating leadership model that comes out of Pirkei Avot. Because here is something really fascinating about Pirkei Avot. On the one hand, Pirkei Avot is about personal growth. We've spoken about this many times in this series. It's Bein Adam La'atzmo. It's how we develop ourselves and build ourselves personally. And yet, when you look at Pirkei Avot, you'll find there are a number of Mishnahs which are about leadership and taking responsibility for others. There are Mishnahs like in chapter 1, Mishnah 8, Mishnah 9, chapter 4, Mishnah 7 that address themselves to the judges, to the Dayanim. In chapter 1, Mishnah 10, chapter 2, Mishnah 4, chapter 3, Mishnah 2 talks about relationship with government. It talks about leadership. So it has leadership concepts in it. What are leadership concepts doing in Pirkei Avot? It's about personal growth. That's what it's really about. So the Rambam says, look, if you don't grow personally and refine your character traits, you can't be a good leader. That's what the Rambam says. He says that's why it's actually here. He says, why is Avot here after Sanhedrin, at this part of the Shas, in the section of the Talmud? Because it's dealing in this section with the laws of judges. And he says that you have to, anyone who exercises public power over another person has to be constantly working on their own personal character traits, because any shortcoming in their personal character traits has terrible impact on the people around them, because they exercise so much power. Therefore, leaders have to be more careful than anybody. So that's how the Rambam explains it. But I wanted just to add what emerges from this, and this would explain why Pirkei Avot deals with leadership, is that when we're looking for a Torah leadership model, Avot provides this for us, because there's some leadership models which are top-down. There are other leadership models which are bottom-up. What is the Torah leadership model? Pirkei Avot teaches us it's from the inside out. In other words, you lead yourself, then you lead the people around you. And that is crystallized at the core by this mission. In other words, if I'm not for myself, who'll be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And in a place where there are no leaders, then I strive to be a leader. In other words, I take responsibility for myself, then I take responsibility for the people around me. But I can only begin to exercise leadership and impact on the people around me if I'm prepared to take responsibility for myself. And this touches on every part of human endeavor and life. That applies to marriage. It applies to parenting. When a person is husband and wife, it starts by saying, I've got to take responsibility for myself, meaning I've got to work on myself and my own character traits and be more patient and more understanding and more loving and more caring. Then I can start to engage with another person, whether it's as a spouse or as a parent, or it's in the context of a business, or it's within the context of society, of the Jewish community, of whatever it is. It starts by taking personal responsibility for self. And once I get that right, then I can start to move on to make a difference in the lives of others. But I have to feel that deep sense of personal responsibility. And that is why Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, we come back to our Parsha, was the greatest of all Jewish leaders in our entire history, because he's described as the most humble of all people. He took personal responsibility. He was deeply refined. He was deeply humble. He was deeply filled with empathy and understanding and compassion. And when he had those qualities, and that's why God in a way said to him, you may not be the best orator, but what I'm looking for in a leader is not necessarily the best orator. What I want in the leader of the Jewish people who's going to lead us out of Egypt and take the people to the foot of Mount Sinai, I want a leader who's a master of themselves. I want a leader who is humble and kind and compassionate, and from there, everything else will flow. Don't worry about the eloquence of the words. Your brother Aaron will speak for you. You are the right person for this job. And he becomes our role model as we take personal responsibility in our lives and help the people around us, and through that, make this world into a better place.